Hello everyone, welcome to a quick tutorial on physically based rendering, also known as PBR rendering. So what is PBR rendering? Well, it's an approach to texturing and rendering that uses several texture maps to control different properties, determining how material reacts to light. So the big thing here is it saves us a lot of computation power. It handles a lot of shading and lighting. And the big idea is that it tries to give us a real world or realistic look to our computer graphics in a way that normal materials and textures can't really achieve. So keeping that in mind, I have some examples over here. So note that this is a flat plane in Blender. Here's the texture on the side. So it's these rocks. See that it is, if I were to select here and go into edit mode, it is a single face down here. Now if I were to hold down Z and go into the material preview, it's still pretty flat. But if I were to go into the rendered view, let's look at this from an angle, and full screen, enhance image. Look at that. It is a flat plane with a flat map on it, a flat texture. Yet somehow it's able to create this really cool looking 3D effect. And see how it reacts to the light that I've got currently hovering over this object. This is actually really freaking cool. If I were to take that light and let's say I were to move it over here. Sorry, my computer has the processing power of a potato. See how it's responding to the light? That source is moved to the side over there now. This is actually insane. It looks super cool. So yeah, this is one example of PBR, and I know it looks like it's just one texture, but it's actually multiple. We'll get into that a bit more over here. So what's going on with this example? So if I hold down Z, I go into the material preview. It is really fighting for its life here. There we go. So this consists of 5 different textures or materials. If I were to move this here, we have a diffuse, we have an ambient occlusion, we have a normal, we have a rough, and we have a displace. So all 5 of those come together to give us this sort of effect. It's necessary to have at least the diffuse and the normals. Everything else is just extra, but it does help achieve a nice effect. So I'd recommend while following through with this tutorial, you create all 5 of these alongside me. So this plane over here, we've got these sort of bricks. See how it's creating this almost 3D look to the bricks. It looks like some of them are sunk. But also look at the moment this depixelates, look at the little grooves over here, the tiny creases, how the light sort of reflects. Very nice. Let me go into solid view again, and if I go into edit mode on this, we're dealing with one big face as well. Cool, so that's 2 examples. So where do we get these textures from? Well, you can create them yourself, but I actually recommend that to get started you get these from Polyhaven. So Polyhaven over here, just search up Polyhaven, look for textures, and you'll see there's a few different, well, I say there's a few, there's actually an enormous freaking amount of these. Just pick one that looks like it's got some nice grooves, like that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool as well. Avoid a texture that's too flat, because then you won't really get to see some of our texturing in action. You want something that is a little bit rigid or rough or bumpy or has grooves. So I'm probably going to go for, I really liked that bark sort of, ooh, this is nice. That bark willow is cool. Choose whichever one you fancy. I think I'll go for, why not this one? Stone wall, or I'll go for the bark actually. Let's do this. So when you select the texture that you want, note over here in my example, I have plaster, 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 plaster. And then I have got rock, 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 rock. So I've got the ambient occlusion, the diffuse, the displace, the normal, and the rough. Ambient occlusion, diffuse, displace, normals, and rough. So it's the same 5 maps per thing. And where do we get those maps from? Well, after you've selected the texture that you want, click on this sort of 1, 2, 3 line drop down, and it'll bring up all of these different maps. We want, as I guess we can do JPEGs, we don't have to do PNGs. We want the ambient occlusion, which is the AO. We want the diffuse. We want the displacement. We want the normal. And we want the rough. So essentially we want everything except this one that I've highlighted, the AO slash rough slash metal. So just give those a mo to download. You might even have to right click and save them to your computer. So I'll be back with you guys in a mo, the second I've got that all done. Alright, so check this out. I've got my bark over here, all 5 of them. Let me quickly explain what each one does. So the very first map is a diffuse map. Everything in a video game that has got color uses a diffuse map. So diffuse basically means color. It's the straight up raw color that is chucked onto an object. See these bricks? They have a sort of brownish diffuse, very dark brown diffuse for these rocks, and then the diffuse here for the bark is this tree color. That's diffuse. It's the raw color that's just plastered onto an object. Then there's the displacement. So displacement is also known as a bump map. This gives us huge grooves and things like that in our objects. If I show you this over, sorry, that's an ambient. A displacement would be this. It would be this. And it would also be, where is, here we go. So this displacement, note that it's black and white, monochrome. So there is a very, very good reason for this, which is best described here. So here's the displacement. And then if I go to the side, here is a normal diffuse map. So our diffuse map is the raw color, the displacement are all the bumps and grooves. And how does it work? Well, imagine you have a bunch of tar black mountains, right? Like pitch black. And it starts snowing. Where does the snow accumulate first? It will accumulate on the tops of all the mountains first. So when looking at a displacement map like this, this is how I visualize what parts will stand out and what parts will sink down. The white parts stand out. I like to imagine they're the tops of canyons or mountains, and the darkest, blackest parts are the deepest, sunk in parts to the texture. So these would be like those valleys going between. Maybe there are rivers very deep down between these mountains. And this is what it looks like in color. So the mountain tops, note there's over here, we have these tops over here, and then this sort of gorge going through is that dark black gorge there. So that is an example of a diffuse and displacement working together. And here's the result. That exact same map that I just showed you now, there's the diffuse for our color and the displace, giving it the high and low rises. And here's another example as well, and another example over here. So these are all using 2 maps, no more than 2. But of course, we can go more into this, which brings us to our other maps. So we have diffuse, displacement, which is also known as bump, the normals map. So the normals map is usually blue, like this. Sometimes you might get some red, which you will have to fix in Blender. There are tutorials on that, but normal maps are for all of your tiny little details. They also tell the computer what side or direction your polys should face. What I mean is, if it's blue, it means that your object is facing towards the outside. That is blue. So like a Minecraft dirt block, we would be able to have this face outward, so when the player comes around and has a look, like here's a player over here, here's his nose, here's his mouth, he's like, wow, I just found dirt, that's crazy. He can see the materials, he can see the color of the dirt block because it's facing outwards. The normal map on this would look a little bit like that. It would be blue, blue, blue. However, we can have a normal map that could be red as well. And what does that mean? If it were facing the inside, so it would be red, it means that we wouldn't see any of those textures from the outside. Everything would be facing the inside instead. Because computers and video games only render one side of an object. So they could render this side, but they could not render the back side. There are exceptions to this, but generally it means that your Minecraft dirt block would look something like this, which is also part of what we use for when we do Minecraft X-ray hacks and stuff like that. So yes, our guy would be very, very, very confused. On a side note, if you want to be able to see the normals for your objects, like these normals over here, these normals here, what you can do is you can go to the object and this drop down here, where it's got like the see-through circle and then the filled up circle. If you click on this drop down, you'll see there is something you can tick that says face orientation. So see how that is blue? This object has got a very, very basic normals map. If you don't see a color change there when you go to the normals map, what you may have to do is select the object, and then you will probably have to say UV, Smart UV Project, which will UV unwrap your object for you. Basically, it just goes and cuts it up. Now you should be able to go to this drop down and then say face orientation and see all blue. So if you have a face where, let me go to face selection mode, let's say this one here. So if you have a face where I'm going to go here and let me just say mesh normals flip. Alright, if you have something like this, now we've got red on our normals map. So in these instances here, these are all good, but this one I have a problem. There's a little bit of red. If you ever want to fix that, what you just have to do is select the face that is red, go to mesh, go to normals, and say flip. Or you can say recalculate outside. So if I say Shift N, which is the shortcut, N for Nedbank, which is a very South African reference, then it should automatically make everything go towards the outside. Or you can just select the thing and you can go Mesh, Normals, Flip. So yes, use that as a reference in case you have this issue later on while following. That's the normals map, which is for our small little, very fine details. So those would be our little grooves and crevices. Then we have our roughness, which is also known as a speck map. So this controls your shininess. It kind of works opposite to the displace or bump map. So the colors are almost always inverted. So if I go over here, so that's the displace. Here is an example of a rough. Here's another example of a rough. Here's one more example of a rough. So the premise of what I'm getting to over here is that usually with our roughness or our spec maps, the lighter parts are often a bit shinier and the darker parts are less shiny. So it's the opposite of the displace generally. See how the colors have flipped around here. Here we've got dark colors for the grooves, whereas here we have dark colors for the not shiny. So that's a Photoshop life hack. If you're quickly making these, you can just take the displace or bump and you can invert. So here's an example of what I mean. So I've got a material. I'm going to double click on it here to unlock it. Very cool. And I'm also going to duplicate it so that I have the original one preserved and hide it. So this material here, I can go to image mode. I can say grayscale. And don't merge. And then say discard. Alright, so as a bump map, this is coming along. I can also say image adjustments and levels, and I can push the extremes by clicking and dragging here. So see how I'm gradually getting that bump map look, or that displace map look, although this one's quite a bit brighter. So if I go back here, I can even say image mode adjustments, brightness, contrast. I can pump up the brightness and I can pump up the contrast. And that gives me a pretty decent looking displace. But let's say I want to get this rough, right? A cool thing that you can do is you can say it should be select. Actually, let's just say image adjustments, and here's invert. It's Control I. Bam! Just like that, we've gone from a diffuse to a displace to a rough. So yeah, that immediately gives us 3 of the 5 textures / materials that we need. So just good to know as reference. Okay, moving on. So this controls the shininess. Very, very cool. Very, very mindful. Very, very demure. The last one is the ambient occlusion, which basically tells Blender how to handle scattering light particles across the material or texture. So it's a little bit of a different one from the others. Sometimes we refer to these as crevice maps as well. But there's an example of an ambient occlusion. Usually you want to make the corners of your objects very, very dark. So this is what I mean. So see this image over here? See how all the little corners and things are like super dark? This would be an ambient occlusion map or a crevice map. Here's another very good example. I know it looks a little bit janky, but that is kind of perfect for our purposes. But yes, if you're ever looking for examples of these, that's a very good one as well. Bless you. Just search these up on Google. But there are quite a few examples. Here's one for a person, kind of scary. And then here's one for interior decor. But yes, all in all, that gives us our 5 maps that we need. So I'm going to timestamp that here, and we'll move on to actually making stuff. So please open up a new Blender project. Alright, so I have a new Blender project over here with the default cube. I'm going to delete the default cube, then I'm going to add a default cube, then I'm going to delete the default cube again, then I'm going to Shift A, add a plane. Here it is. I'm going to scale that plane up a little bit. And once I'm happy with the scale, I'm just going to say Control and A. Let me bring up my shortcuts quick. There we go. Right, so I'm going to say Control and A, and I'm going to apply all transforms. Alright, I'm also looking at this in the solid view. If you hold down Z, you go into solid view. Cool. So I have the textures that I want from Polyhaven, which are all of the bark ones. These up here. Okay. So let's see. I'm going to add in a new light. So let me remove this old one. I'm going to say Shift A. Let's add a light, a point light. And I'm going to move it up on the Y-axis a little bit. Around so. Just eyeball it. Pretty lit. Right. And after that, I'm going to go to the light bulb data properties here. It's this green bulb icon. I'm going to change this power to 100 watts. Some people who I tested this with required 1,000 or 2,000, so we can't exactly see it just too well on an actual texture, but if you go into the rendered view, you will see that light there doing a little bit of work. So I think 200 is actually pretty cool. I'll keep it at 200 for now. But yes, so just adjust your light. If you're not seeing any big change, you might have to change this to like 1000 even. Alright, I'm also going to go here into the TV button near the top, second from the top, called our render properties. I'm going to change from EV into computer heavy breathe mode, also known as cycles. And device is CPU. I'm going to say GPU compute, because that's just going to run faster for me. If I use my CPU, I am cooked, wallahi. And I'm also going to change from supported to experimental, which will come in useful later on. So now if I go into the rendered view, it takes time now to render images, and that's because Cycles is a higher quality render engine. Okay, so that gives us everything there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go onto the plane. So click the plane, go into the red planet Earth looking chessboard known as the materials property window. So click on that, say new. Alright, sorry about that. So just say new, and this will give us our material over here. So this is not looking too bad. Let's drag across from the top here. So if you just hover over and drag from the top, see how your mouse turns into a crosshair. It'll allow you to click drag a new window. And you can also do that going from the bottom up as well, which actually gets pretty scary. But yes, and if you want to close that window, all you do is you right click in an empty space, and it should allow you to, if it's not finicky for me, please, and if I click here, right click, I can say close area. There we go. So I'll open up one over here, and I'm going to change this to the shader editor. There we go. So this will only show things if you have got a normal material on it, which in this case I do. Okay, let's click in here and say Shift A and add an image texture. I'm going to move this to the side. So if you want a guide for what we're setting up, we're going to be making this. So this is the first material, then the second one, then the third one, and the fourth one. And we're going to eventually get to this, where we do a little bit of tinkering to get this sort of look. So yes, this is our first image texture over here. So I'm going to say, let's say, open an image, and let's look for that very first map, which I had down here inside of maps. It was bark, and I think it was diffuse. Yeah, so diffuse. We want the color space to be RGB, and this is the only material that we have, the only texture that will keep an RGB color space. The rest will not have this. I'm also going to change to material preview, and then I'm going to click drag from color into base color. So there we go. Here is the diffuse for our bark. If I hide my light, no. Okay, it does seem pretty whitish. If I go into the hectic render mode over here, it looks a little bit better. But of course we don't get any cool bumpiness or anything like that because we've still got to integrate that. So this is our diffuse. So diffuse maps define color and texture. All objects in games have diffuse maps. If they have color, they have diffuse maps. Alright, so let's also go Shift A and add a texture coordinate. Let me see if I can find that. There we go. And let's see if I can find a vector mapping. That's perfect. So I'm going to move the texture coordinate up here and the texture mapping over here. So the purpose of this is I'm just having it that essentially all of our materials are going to inherit from these. These control the scale of our materials and our textures. If I were to change the scale of the diffuse, that would not change the scale of our other materials. If I go over here and I'll show you the finished version, see how I'm using a scale of 2 on everything, and everything is hooked up into our mapping. So that means they all are influenced by the same scale. I don't have to run the risk of scaling one of these and the others don't follow. So that means I could have light and color and stuff bleeding off the edges of the plane, which is not something I want. Cool. So we have this. Now what we need to do is we need to take our generated and hook it up to vector. Let me find them. Here's vector. He's fighting he's committing crime with both direction and magnitude. Very, very cool. Alright, so there's our boy. Let's go back over here. So we plug this into the vector, and then we can take the vector and chuck this into the vector. The square goes in the square hole. There we go. So that sets up our mapping, which means now if you want to change the scale, so see on the side here, let me zoom in. If I change this to something like 2, there we go. Now it's twice as big on the scale. This will apply to whatever other textures we hook in as well, because we can always click, drag, and hook in more. Cool. So it keeps everything like coherent. So yeah, I advise you change the scale on X, Y, and Z to 2. I'm going to add in Shift A new image texture. Okay, so we are moving now from, in this guide map, section 1 through to section 2. So this is our normals map, which is the sort of bluish one here, for all of those tiny little, very demure and very mindful creases. So I've got this image texture, I'm going to say open, I'm going to go into downloads, let's look for the normal, radio. Change the color space to non-color, from RGB to non-color. We also need a normal map node, so if you search up normal map, this one specifically, strength stay at 1, make sure it's tangent space, and we're going to take this and this, arrange them like so. We're going to connect the color to the color, and then the normal to the normal. Give it a bit to calculate. Look at that, we're starting to get a bit more definition. if I go into the rendered view, hey, that lighting is starting to come along nicely. Look at that. Not sure how clearly it shows up on screen for you guys, but for me it's starting to look pretty swag. Alright, so that is our normal. If I were to take this and instead, let's actually take this and plug this in here. Give it a bit. Here, there's the normal map. This is what we are dealing with. The blue and the white. If I go into rendered, yeah, kind of looks like the surface of the moon. If the surface of the moon was made out of wood instead of cheese. Yeah, so that is our normal map with our normal map node. Please make sure you're up to this point. So yes, the final key point about the normal map is that it gives us an illusion of more detail. Note that my poly count is still 1, yet when I look at this from different angles, it subtly looks like I've got all of this extra detail going on here now. There are tiny little grooves and crevices starting to form. Okay, so that brings us to the third part of this guide image, which is our roughness map over here. So our roughness is the shininess. So this one's pretty straightforward. Let's go back into Blender. Shift A, new image texture. See, there's a theme that's starting to form. And, ooh, that reminds me actually. We did not apply the same scale to the normal map. We do need to fix that. So if you go to the vector over here on the blue mapping texture node, plug that into vector for the normal. Much better. That is actually a dramatic improvement. Now it's not so janky anymore. It doesn't look like a bubble bath. It actually does look a little bit more wood-like now. Okay. So let's do the same with our roughness over here. So these should always be plugged in by default. Please don't forget to do it like I did. I'm going to open up, let's say downloads, let's say maps, and let's say rough, also known as spec. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to click drag from color into, I think we can go with roughness for this. Yeah. So let's say color straight to roughness. Just give it a bit. Cool. If you get a slider for your roughness, just make it 1. But basically, without me having this connected, see how it's on 0.5? So roughness can go from 0 all the way through to 1. And you can see it's taking effect over here. So 0 is completely reflective. It's basically a mirror. 1 has no reflection whatsoever. So this would be something like a solid wall or the color Vanta Black. Alright, so this would be a roughness of 0. See how it's reflecting? This one as well. This would be a roughness of 1, Vanta Black, which is a color that reflects absolutely no light. It is insanely cool. Like on this car over here, the only thing that's reflecting are the windows. But yes, so ideally when working with this, you want to kind of find a nice balance depending on the material. So we could adjust the slider, so there it's basically a mirror, see that? Look at that, it's reflecting the Blender default environment. 1, it's reflecting nothing at all. Luckily for us, we don't have to make that choice because we can just say color, yoink, into roughness, spadoink. Our map or texture takes care of that all for us automatically. Brilliant. Cool. And if we go into the rendered view over here, it's a little bit hard to see. I probably should have chosen a brighter texture or material. but yes, it is going into effect. Right, so that is the third bit done here. Now our next one is my favorite type of map, a displacement or bump map. These are insanely cool because they give you the biggest amount of change. So yes, make sure that this is also set to non-color. Sorry, I almost forgot. There we go. Yeah, that's looking groovy, pun intended. I think I might actually just go here and increase the power of that light even more. Look at that. We're getting a lovely texture over there. Lovely, isn't it? Yes, it's coming along. It's all coming together now. So what we're going to have to do next is we're going to essentially add in our displacement. All right, displacement. So let's go over here. I'm going to swap this to solid view. I'm going to go into my modifiers and I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. Okay, we get a cylindrical shape. We don't really want that. Let's swap this to simple. And then let's change the amount to 6 and 6 in the levels viewport and the render. And with all of that, let's also uncheck optimal display. And we can apply that. There we go. So here is a nice subdivide. I'm going to use this to improve the quality of our bump map. You don't have to apply the modifier if you don't want to, but I'm going to work with an applied one. Alrighty. So let's go into the render engine, this little TV icon. Make sure that you've got it set to experimental, which is something that we did a bit earlier. We need to enable adaptive subdivision, which if we scroll down over here, so we've got subdivision down here. Let me just double check quickly. Sorry, my bad. Adaptive subdivision is here, and it only shows up after we've changed it to experimental. So there it is. So I can apply now. Cool. So we have our adaptive subdivision. Let's go into the red materials tab. So in the settings and the surface, let's see, what can we do here? There are a few things that we will have to change. So in the surface, it says displacement, bump only. So I'm in settings, surface, displacement, bump only. Let's change this to displacement and bump. We can also change the displacement scale as well inside of our shader. So let's put it together inside of our shader, and then I'll show you how you can change that scale. So we go down here, Shift A, let's look for a new image texture, yoink, yoink, there he is. Same thing, we need to take the vector and we need to plug that into the vector, vector to vector, client-to-client communication. We go into downloads, maps, let's look for displace, spark displace. Okay, so there's our displace. We change it from RGB to non-color. We're also going to have to add a displacement node. So go Shift A and search up displacement, not vector displacement, just normal displacement. And we're going to set the color to being the height. Right, here is our scale. You can change this to something like 0.7 if you want. I'm going to stick with 1. Let's take that, and I'm going to connect this through to displacement here at the end. This one will take a while to configure. Right. So let's see, set to object space, which is correct. These settings are correct. Okay, let's go into rendered view. Look at that. That is beautiful. He says as the pixels on screen slowly render themselves. Yes. Look at that. Tell me that's not cool. It's a frigging plane, bruv. And we've got all of these nice rigid details coming out. Reminder, if you do want to change the scale, you can do so over here. So like 0.7, of course, see how it goes down a bit. Surrogate down. If I make it 0.07, now it's a very subtle change. So I'm going to actually just stick with 1. Because I think that looks freaking cool. But yes, we're not actually done. There's more. There's one more map, people. So that's our displacement. Let's move this across to the side. So according to the image we've been following, over here, that's all done. And that's hooked in. Our next thing involves a little bit of configuration. We're going to have to move some things around, which I apologize for, but it's necessary. So this is the next one, which is to add our ambient occlusion map. And we're going to have to sort of swap around our diffuse and do some cool black magic juju stuff over there. But let's get to that now. Okay, so I have got these. The diffuse is up here. I've got some empty space to work with this last one. Okay. So let's go Shift A and add an image texture. Wow, how original, right? Let's look for our ambient occlusion, which remember this controls light. So let's change that from RGB to non-color. There are a few things that we're going to have to bring into this as well. Namely, we're going to have to add in a multiply node. So if you search up multiply, okay, well, it doesn't want to find it for me. Give me a mo. Sorry, if you can't find that specific node, I didn't realize I had a plugin. Look for mix color. So search up mix color. So mix color is this yellowish node. We want to set it from mix to multiply. And we're going to change the factor to 1. Alright, so this is essentially going to allow us to take our normal like diffuse over here, our color, and we're going to combine it with our lighting. So we take them, we cook them together, and we send one concentrated thing through. So let's actually do a before and after. So here is our before. And I'm going to work with it on the side here. It's a little bit choppy for me. Alright, so first things first, vector to vector. Then we are going to take the color from our ambient occlusion and we're going to put it into slot B. Then we're going to take the color from our diffuse and we're going to put it into slot A. And after all of that, we're going to take the result, and the result becomes our new base color plugin. And now watch the before and after on the right hand side. So it's done a subtle change over here, but if I zoom in, you will see that this actually is handling the light far better now. So let's just let that declutter a bit. I really need to upgrade my PC. Damn. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just move this to the side. I'm going to take my light and let's go bird's eye view. So now I can move this light around the wood. no matter where I move it, it can handle the reflections. It's actually pretty cool. I can even give this light a subtle tint to it, a subtle red, and it handles those reflections beautifully. Let's make it a subtle yellow. Usually when you're lighting things, you want to have a red light, a green light, and a blue light in the scene. But I'll just stick with a pure white light for the time being. But yes, so it is struggling. There we go. The final setup that we have at the end of all of that is this. So everything down here is as normal. Everything up here is our new and adjusted setup, which concludes this image over here as well. So the last thing that I wanted to point out was this factor over here, which I didn't actually explain properly. So this is the shadow that we have between all of our ridges. So the higher the factor, the darker the shadows between your ridges. You can see it's cooking a little bit on the side here. But yes, so what would the next step be? Well, we could actually enable ray tracing. But that would require you to go and look for a proper specialist on ray tracing, because admittedly that's a little bit out of my scope. But if I were to go back here, let's look at this. So hopefully now, looking back on this material, things make a little bit more sense for you now on how our 5 different texture maps all come together to give us a result like this. It's worth the hassle. Alrighty, I'm going to make a timestamp there, and then I'm going to move on to baking, let's say, normal maps. Alrighty. Alright, next thing on the chopping block. Here I have got an axe. And this axe slash halberd, it has got some sculpting on little Among Us's. A lot of very small little Among Us's. This one's doing the splits. This one's got some hearts. Ooh, this one has seen better days. But yes, they are quite literally all over the show. They are everywhere, like a virus. Now what is going on here? How come I can't see the texture here, but I can see it here? Well, I think the more pressing thing is when I go into edit mode, I have sculpted detail that is not influencing my poly count. This entire shape, this entire weapon is 5,393 faces or polys. Sorry, it's 2,393, yeah. 2,393 faces, yet I have sculpted detail. So how have I managed to achieve that? Well, it's a little bit of a life hack. Here is the high poly version. If I move that to the side. So Deus Mogus, and it's got like these bumps. It has all of this sort of detail running down. Now this version, if I were to go into edit mode, look at all of that. This thing has got 615,000 faces and counting. So essentially what I've done is I've taken detail from the super advanced high poly and I've managed to chuck it onto the low poly version. And that is all the work we need to do, given there are a few things that we have to do in the inspector on this side. So yes, what you will need is you will need 2 different versions of your weapon, and they have to be on the exact same spot in the world. So if I just move this back, there we go. So I have the high poly and the low poly versions in the exact same spot in the world. And we're going to be doing some cool stuff with that. So make sure that you have your weapons. I'm going to open up a new Blender project where I start from afresh with this. Alright, so I have a new Blender project. I'm going to delete the default cube. I'm going to add a default cube. And I'm going to delete the default cube. And then I'm going to say File, let's import an FBX. I'm going to go through to where I have my weapons saved as FBXs, which are down inside of here. So I have an axe high poly and an axe low poly. Let's import both. Give it a bit. Alright. So I have the high poly one, which is 600,000 plus faces, and I have the low poly one, which is, should be, let's hide this. Let's hide this as well, show this, which is the 2,500. Okay, I'm going to rename this over here. So let's say, I'll actually just say axe low. And then the other one I'll rename as axe high. Okay, so get them into the same position, your two weapons. And what you can do if they are off position like this, and you have your cursor over here at the center of the world, you can select one of the axes. You can say Shift and S, and you can say selection to cursor, and then I can select this one here and say Shift S, selection to cursor. If your cursor is not in the center of the world, you can say Shift S, cursor to world origin. The cursor is that Where's Wally colored little plus sign. So yep, the center of my axes, my halberds, are technically offset. So this, in the case of my weapons, is correct, but I can also just manually click drag those like that, and then say Control A, apply all the transforms. So now if I move this across and I say Shift S, let's say Shift S, selection to cursor, now it snaps to the center of the world. Very cool. So that is everything there. Activate my shortcuts. Select both weapons, and once you've moved them to the center of the world, say Control A, apply all transforms. Let's also check the normals. So we can do that with this drop down here with the see-through circle and the colored circle, and it's face orientation. So everything here is blue, which means all of our detail is facing towards the outside, which is good. If all is blue, you are good. If anything is red, you will have to change that. So if you go into, let me actually use the low poly, because it won't brick my computer. So if any of these faces, let's go face mode. If I delete these faces, there. Now you can see inside the weapon. See how the inside is red? Red does not get rendered by the computer. Blue does. So in other words, we are not rendering the inside of our object, because that would make our game very unoptimized and it would chug the CPU. So if you are in a position where, let's say, these are, let's say, flip. If these are red on the outside, which is not what we want. If you're ever in a position like that, just go into edit mode, press A, and you should be able to say mesh, normals, and then recalculate outside. I think Shift N is the shortcut. Yes, Shift N to recalculate normals. So just make sure your normals are all good, everything is normal, and then you can go out of face orientation mode. Okay, so what we need to do now is we need to go to the low poly, this one over here. And on the low poly, we do need to unwrap this. So I'm going to drag this across here. In this low poly, we can do a smart UV unwrap, or we can manually go around and we can select and make seams. By the way, if you ever get these blue lines like this, I believe the shortcut is Control E, and then you say clear sharp, and then you can right click, go out of that, right click shade flat. That removes those blue lines. But yes, you can manually go through this, select all of these, and then you can right click and mark them as a seam. If you want to by hand start cutting apart your weapon, I have an example over here, I believe. Let me hide the high poly, go to the low, go into edit mode. Maybe this one I did not mark seams, but there is one I have where I did. Here is another example I've got. So if I go into edit mode on this, if you want to manually add seams, you would have to do this. Let's say UV editor, and let's swap this from the normals. Can I bring the, then I'll keep it there for now. If you want to manually create seams, you would have to go through by hand and put together something that looks like this. Note the red lines. This is just cutting up the texture. And I have this face over here. Press A, and this is how it has cut it up on the side for me. So that is if you want to take the manual route, which in some cases, believe it or not, the end result actually does look nicer than the smart UV unwrap. But I've basically taken this axe and I've cut it directly in half. Manual selection. Yes, very fun. So you can do that. For the purposes of what I'm doing here with you guys, I'm not going to do all of that by hand now because I'm lazy. So let's move this across and let's select the whole thing and go UV, Smart UV Project instead. There's an island margin here as well. This island margin, by trial and error, it's good to have the island margin at around 0.03 or 0.04. I'll just say that. Let me bring up the UV editor. So check this. This is an island margin of 0.03, if I remember correctly. So this here is the entire shape. In edit mode, I pressed A to select the whole thing. The entire shape before we smart UV project. The entire shape after we smart UV project. Sorry, make the island 0.0, did I say 0.03 or 0.003? 0.003. This works quite well. The margin is the amount of space between each different shape, also known as islands. So yes, there we go. So that gives us our smart UV projection axe or halberd, which is what we're going to end up needing in order to bring all of that sculpted detail across. All right, so let's go into the shading tab. And that's going to chug my computer, so I'm going to go into the poor person's shading tab, my shading tab. So I'll bring up the shader editor on the side here. Alright, yo. So let's go into the render settings. I'm going to change into cycles. I'm going to say GPU compute, and I'm going to say experimental. Reason being is because when we do baking and stuff like that, it doesn't actually work in Eevee. We will need to do baking and everything using cycles. So I apologize for everybody who has the computing speed of a potato like myself. Alright, so we have shading tab on the side. We've gone into cycles. Scroll down until you find a tab that's called Bake. So we need to actually change a few things in here. So we need to change from combined into normal because we are dealing with normal map details. Those are like these blue ones here. They're the tiny little sort of crevices, because that's essentially what we're doing with our sculpted detail. We're going to turn it into a normal map, and we're going to slap it on the low poly version from the high poly version. So make sure that you swap into normal. So yes, this will show all of our angles and our edges. Let's say Z, we're in solid view. Let's also show the high poly. So see that the high poly detail is actually cutting through the low poly. We've got some, I think it was called Z fighting, if I remember correctly, here, where the render is trying to decide what shape to show on top of the other. So yes, all this detail that is sticking through, we're going to turn that, the detail sticking through, into our normal map, and we're going to chuck it onto our low poly cheap version. Okay, so please make sure you have both weapons showing. Select the low poly one and say Shift D to duplicate it, and just click so that it stays in the center of the world. I'm going to rename it to Cage, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Tab into Edit Mode, A to select everything, and I'm going to say Alt S. So this allows me to scale along the normals. Keep increasing the scale of your cage until all of the detail from the high poly version of your weapon is covered. So we've got a chunky, freaking beefy ass weapon here. If you don't scale it up enough, you will end up with this sort of look. See here how I've got some things that are kind of cut. If I go into material preview, see the low poly version here has got some cut detail. So that cage was not big enough for it. So rather go for a bigger cage than a smaller one. Size does matter here. So yes, increase the scale of the cage. You don't want any of that little detail sticking out. Nothing. Page turn. Okay, so now that we have just gone and scaled this up, make sure it's called cage. Let's hide the cage and let's hide the high poly so that we've got only the low poly version showing. I'm going to go back into object mode. Okay, so we have the low poly version selected, the others are hidden. Go into the red planet Earth icon for your materials tab and add a new material over here. Let me bring this to the side and zoom in. Okay, so let's Shift A, add an image texture, and we're going to say new, and let's call it Axe Normal. I'm going to change from 1024, which is the level of detail. I'm going to give it double the amount of detail, so 2048. Let's see, the alpha, we don't really need to worry about the rest of that. Let's just say new image. There we go. Okay, and then with this, let's select this image texture over here. So physically click drag over it. And let's go into the baking tab. So that was up here. And bake is down here. So I'm in the TV icon. Alrighty-o. Now follow along very closely because this next part is very intricate. So I have got the texture selected, this empty image texture, which I am eventually going to connect. And it connects in through to the, we're going to add another layer between that. So have this selected, select your low poly weapon, go into the bake tab, go into this bake sort of drop down, we need selected to active ticked, and we need to check cage. It's then going to ask us what we want for our cage object as well. So let's go here and show both of these. All right. Okay, so I'm going to select the high poly object. Then I'm going to control select the low poly object. So high poly, then control select the low poly. Note it's still got the image texture selected. Then I'm going to click on the little eyedropper for the cage, and I'm going to select the object cage, which puts it there. It's very important, the order. It's high poly first, then low poly, then the cage, and you have to make sure that this is still highlighted. Very convoluted, but after all of that is done, you can just click bake. And you should see a loading bar down here. That's how you know that it's going to start doing all of our texture baking. This is going to take me a little bit of time, not because it's complicated, but because my computer is very potato. Let's see, did it work? Is it done? Okay, and it looks like we're back. I think that's the fastest it's ever attempted baking this. Very cool. So it should usually take a few minutes. So I'm just going to give this a bit. Okay, my computer's no longer heavy breathing. If I go down from the shader editor, I go into the UV editor, I can actually bring up the result. So here is our normal map. That's pretty freaking cool. Note that nothing is blood red. So this essentially is just like these normal maps that we put together over here. That's quite nice, actually. It's a lot neater than my other one. But yes, that is our normal map that we've just made now, and we've just baked it now. What we can actually do here is we can now hide the cage and we can hide the high poly. So that information has all been saved here inside of our image texture because we had it selected. Of course, in the material preview, we can't see any of that yet. So let's add the ability to see it. So it's not just a simple connection. We do need to add something in between. So let's Shift A and add a normal map vector node. Alrighty. We're going to connect from color to color. Let's keep the strength at 1. And then we're going to connect from normal to normal. There we go. Bam. Quite literally before, after. We've just slotted in a whole bunch of detail. So with that put together, let's see if it, yeah, I'd have to add some proper lighting into our rendered view. But yes, let me double check that I'm not missing anything for you guys. Yes, that is the end of this bit of the tutorial over here. So it actually shows a little bit clearer on the back. Given this was not a very high quality engraving that I gave, this is not bad for preserving detail. So yes, please make sure you've got that saved. And that's our act's done. And we are back for the very last part of this tutorial, which has gone over an hour now, which is actually crazy. Alright, so sending the object's textures or materials from Blender into Unity. So if you don't have those textures / materials saved as a separate thing, we'll have to do that here. Okay. Very first thing, your object needs to have a UV map. If I go into the UV editor here, I'm just using a random object as example, which happens to be the plane that we made earlier on. So if you don't have an unwrap UVW over here for this object, what you can do is you can select the object, edit mode, and then you can say A, so that you have the whole thing selected. And if you go into, drag this across, UV, Smart UV Project, let's have an island margin of 0.04 and say OK. So there's not much visible change here, but it has UV unwrapped our image. If you had something like a weapon, like that axe that we were working on, it would make a bit of a change. But yes, make sure that you have UV unwrapped or smart UV projected your object that you want to have the materials get sent through. Okay, so now select the object that you want to send the materials through in object mode. On the side here, I'm going to go into the shader editor. Cool. So this one's already got some things attached to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go Shift A. Let's add a new image texture down here. And I'm going to actually, can I rename this? It would be nice. Let me say, let's say new. I'm going to call it bark bake. I'm going to make it 2048 by 2048. It's very important that you have bake in the name. I'm going to keep the alpha and I'm going to say new image. I'm keeping the alpha because this is the diffuse map. If you were to make other maps like a normal map, you would not need the alpha. Alright, so there we go. I'm now going to go through to the image editor. Okay, so we have this image over here, which is our diffuse map. But if I were to go into bark bake, this drop down, this is the current image texture here. It is a whole lot of nothing. So we need to give this a texture, and then we send this through to Unity. Okay, so it's completely black. Let's go into the render settings. So that's the TV icon, cycles, experimental. I've got GPU compute. If we scroll down, you'll see there's something that is called samples. So the higher the amount of samples, the better the quality. And having blue screened my computer twice while working on this in previous years, for today, I'm just going to set this to 32 and 32. So good field goals are 32, 16, 1024, 2048, etc., etc. I think 4096 is another one, if I remember correctly. But yes, I'm going to stick with 3232 because that has a very quick rendering time. I'm then going to scroll all the way down to bake. And there's some things we're going to have to change over here. Bake type, instead of combined, we're going to say diffuse. No direct influence, no indirect influence, but keep color checked. Okay, next we need to have the 3D object selected, and if I go to the shader editor, we need to have the texture selected. So both the object and the texture. I have color space RGB because this is the color for our object. If it was a different thing, I'd have to have it as non-color. So if we were baking the ambient occlusion or the lighting or the displacement or the rough or whatever, we would have to change that to non-color. But let's just keep this like so. So I'm going to scroll down here. Yes, I've got those already unchecked. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to bake this button up here. The loading bar comes up, 3%, 6%, 9%. So I'm going to pause and I'll come back when it's done. And we are back. It's just about done, so 90%. So yes, the moment this is finished, I'll show you what the result looks like. Right, baking map saved. Let's go and look in the where were we? The image editor. So I'm on the bake. Here it is. So what you would want to logically do next is you can actually save this image. If you go to image, see how it's got a little star next to it? It means it hasn't been saved yet. You can go image and then either save or save as, and it will ask where you want to save it. You can give it a name, and there's a few different things you can change here. So just make sure that you've got that saved. Alright, let's go back into the shader editor. I'm just going to add a principled BSDF. Then I'm going to add a material output. I'm going to connect the color to the base color. I'm going to connect the BSDF to the surface. Alright, so if I go into the rendered view, see how we no longer have that sort of bumpiness, everything that we've put together? That is our pure bake. This is what we have just baked now. So yes, what we have just done here, we will have to do the same thing for that, and for that. But with Unity, you can kind of get away with just having your diffuse and then your normal. There are a few things you would have to do differently for the normal though. If you were to do the normal, Shift A, add a new image texture, you would say new, let's say bark, normal, I'm going to say 2. You would have to remove the alpha here. That's the one change. And then you could change the color space to non-color. In your bake settings on the side here, you would have to swap the bake type from diffuse to normal. And then essentially you'd have to select this, you'd have to select this, you would have to bake once again to get our normal. And with that, let me just give this a test run. It is important to note, yeah, it's going by quite quickly now. It is important to note you can multi-bake as well. But yes, so bake normal over here. So let me pause this quick. Alright, so it was a normal map. So if I search over here for a normal map node, say color to color, and I'll say normal to normal. And then I go into rendered view. So it is actually making a difference with the lighting. And there's subtle creases that I can see are now forming over here. So yes, to see it work, you'd have to do that. But of course, if I go into the image editor now, I go into this drop down, bark normal 2. Here is what we've just put together now. So you would have to go around and bake everything. I see that it's blank. Mayhaps the reason for that is that I made it non-color. Let me check if I can remedy. Alright, so here I've just put together a small experiment where I am attempting to bake a normal map on something that has a color space of sRGB. Now if I were to take this and connect it here, it doesn't look like it's making too much more of a difference. But if I go into the UV editor and I look for the new one I've just added, there's not too much visible difference. So what I recommend you do, because the visible difference shows up more on the object itself, what I recommend you do when baking everything else is that you actually have it hooked up to, oh goodness, is that you actually have it hooked up to non-color as the color space. But yes, you will have to unfortunately do this for every single, yeah, it's so much higher quality with non-color. You'll have to do this for every single type of material that you have. So there's normal, there's the roughness, there should be, yeah, there's a glossy one as well. All of these different, there's ambient occlusion up there. But yes, you will have to run through these. If you want to bake your bump or displacement map, what you'll have to do is check this option over here, bake from multi-res, and then swap your bake type from normals to displacement. Then you'll be able to bake your bump map and you / displacement map. Make sure that for all of these you go into your image editor and you always say image and you save each thing respectively. Then you can send all of that information through into Unity. But if you want more on displacement maps, I recommend this tutorial over here, which is Blender Secrets. Let me just credit this man properly. Alright, so right at the end, I'm just going to give you guys some extra resources. So yes, of course, if you want to send through bump maps, it is Blender Secrets Baking Displacement Maps over here. If you want something more on PBR Textures, look at MK Graphics tutorial, how to add PBR Textures in Blender 4.2. If you want more on exporting them into Unity, look at UGurus, how to bake textures in Blender and export to Unity. If you want more on the high poly to low poly weapon transferal, like engraving and sculpting and baking, all of that detail through, then look at Bro 3D's how to transfer high poly details to low poly objects in Blender. If you want more on lighting for your scenes, look at Keelan John's Blender Beginner Tutorial, Lighting Tutorial Blender 3.4, and look at his other tutorial on rendering over here as well, which is also amazing. I've watched all these tutorials, they are absolute gold. But yes, with his lighting video, usually it's 3 lights. I like to add an extra 4th one, which is this yellow light in the background, which creates a nice effect. But yes, so the next step might be, if you want to do more work in Blender to add proper lighting and rendering, or even ray tracing. And if you want to work in Unity, you'd have to export everything through. But yes, thanks for watching.